Good afternoon. Is anybody listening to you? Do you have the ear of the executive suite in your company? Welcome to our complimentary webinar on how to make the CFO a customer service champion. Today's presentation is sponsored by TMP Direct, delivering unique sales and customer service solutions for over 26 years. I'm your host, Dan Collins, President of TMP Direct. The Customer Care Measurement and Consulting Group, CCMC, has been helping companies develop the framework to gather and package the necessary data to win over your CFOs, CMOs, and CEOs, and make them champions of customer service. If your senior management views customer service as a necessary nuisance and a cost to be minimized, then you will definitely benefit from today's discussion. Today's webinar will provide you a way to translate the customer experience and how it impacts the top line, reduces risk, and controls HR costs. Today's insight will make you heroes of you and your customer service team. I'd like to welcome our featured speaker, John Goodman, Vice Chairman of CCMC. John has managed more than 1,000 separate customer service studies. Business Week credits Mr. Goodman's research for the creation of the GE Answer Center, the original customer satisfaction contact center. John is an author, noted teacher at the Wharton School of Business, and a leading authority on service quality and service re-engineering. His clients have included over 40 of the Fortune 100. As a result of today's discussion, you will go home with a fresh perspective on how to use your data to get the executive suite to listen to your message. Additionally, we will send you a copy of today's presentation. This will be followed by a brief survey asking for your feedback on today's discussion in preparation for our next webinar in our series. A couple of housekeeping items. The presentation will take about 45 minutes. We will reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions. But you can submit your question anytime you would like. You'll see on your screen where you can do that. And if there is a question that comes up during the presentation, we will present it to Mr. Goodman. Hopefully we'll get to all your questions. If not, we will include them in our follow-up. Also, during the webinar, there will be 2 audience polls. We ask that you participate in both. Your feedback's important, and each poll will take about 5 to 10 seconds. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to John Goodman.
Great. Thanks very much, Dan. And the first question I would ask you all, to at least rhetorically, is do you have all the resources you need to do your job? What we're finding is when I ask that with a live audience that very few hands go up. Service and contact center operations have now evolved into customer experience, which is one of the top corporate executive goals, but the issue is how do you get the resources to effectively manage both service and the experience. We're going to be talking about how do you appeal to greed by getting the CFO and the CMO and other functional heads to really buy into your business case. And to be able to do that, you need to have an effective voice of the customer. I'm also going to be, in passing, mentioning some new trends that we've seen in terms of customer response and also preventing unnecessary customer problems. If you play your cards correctly, you can really evolve from being the complaint department to being the customer experience department or the chief customer officer. We find that the organizations that have a financial interest in an improved customer experience are the organizations you can build an alliance with, and we're going to be going through this in a lot more detail. But the primary one is marketing and brand, because they're interested both in retention but also fostering positive word of mouth. And we would argue that your contact center is probably the best word of mouth management mechanism that exists. Finance is interested in higher margins and lower costs. Quality needs your contact data combined with loyalty impact to build the business case to improve quality, because quality is finally figuring out that you aren't just aiming at cost savings, but in fact the corporation needs to grow the top line. So the Lean Six Sigma guys are finally evolving from just cost cutting to enhancing the top line. Channel management wants to get more shelf space, and you don't get more shelf space for organizations where there are problems with customers. Risk, legal, regulatory, and PR have also woken up to the fact that better service reduces claims, lawsuits, regulatory interventions, and PR visibility. And finally, HR, in many cases, is finding that half their voluntary turnover is due to frontline good employees saying, you know, I'm not getting paid enough to take all this stuff. Now, there are two things you can do: pay them more or reduce the hassles. And finally, product development is interested in ideas for innovation, and that, again, can come from a really robust voice of the customer. Now, our basic approach to customer experience is pretty straight. You want to do the job right the first time. Is get defined as we according to spec, which makes great sense except for one minor difficulty called customers who fail to read and do stupid things. It's now to the point where Sharp Electronics has a red placard and when all else fails, try reading the directions. Now, most companies say, look, if the customer is an idiot or did something wrong with our product, it's not our problem. It is your problem because you get blamed for it, plus you have to clean up the mess. The second phase is you have to have an access strategy, which traditionally was average speed of answer. The phone fast, everything's cool. But there's a prerequisite, which is that we find that the majority of customers who have problems with your product or service never bother to call you. So part of access strategy is how do you communicate to the customer base as a whole, we can only solve problems we know about. And that's a prerequisite to being able to have an effective system that answers the phone. The third piece is to have an effective customer contact management system, and that's where most of you sit. But our criticism of most organizations is that they spend all their time responding to the individual customer and less than 2% saying, why are we getting all these calls? An interesting benchmark that you might want to apply is that at Toyota a while back, for every 25 people they had on the phones, they had one full-time person saying, why are we getting these calls? If you aren't focusing on why we're getting those calls, you have doomed yourself to forever being in a firefighting mode. Now, we're going to be building the economic case based on 6 premises drawn from my recent book, Strategic Customer Service. Premise number 1 is that staff doesn't cause most customer dissatisfaction. We find in most organizations the assumption is if you have an unhappy customer, obviously some frontline person has done something wrong, and if we can identify who they are and have a public hanging, life will then be beautiful. We find that in fact 99% of people come to work desperately wanting to do a good job, and if you have a dissatisfied customer, it's because sales set incorrect expectations, or products and processes have unpleasant surprises built into them, or the customer doesn't understand how to use the product. So we find that a lot of organizations, especially finance people, think they can save themselves into prosperity. In fact, enhancing service will enhance the top line, and the revenue payoff of better service and quality is 10 to 20 times the cost implication. People are still paramount, and the two things your frontline staff lack most often is the flexibility to be able to respond to the customer's particular sets of needs and the clear, believable explanations as to why we do what we do. We find in most organizations the reps can articulate the policy, but then if they're asked, why do you have that policy, if they can't defend it, you get one of two answers, which is either, look, Mac, that's our policy, which comes across as rudeness, except in New York, or the other answer is, yeah, that is a stupid policy. I don't know why we do that. I work for a stupid company. So arming your frontline staff with clear, believable explanations is critical, and a to-do would be to ask your staff, what 3 things do we tell you to communicate to the customer that you can't defend? Because if they can't defend them, they're giving one of those 2 answers. Fourth, you want to deliver technology that customers will enjoy. When everyone talks about technology and contact centers, they talk about phone trees, and phone trees tend to drive people nuts, but we even have a silver bullet for that, which is wherever you print the 800 number, print the menu that the customer is going to hit. We find it immediately increases satisfaction and compliance by 20%. But you also want technology to deliver what I call psychic pizza. Now, psychic pizza is where I ring your doorbell and say, here is the pizza you were about to order. To the degree I can anticipate your next need and I get to you before you call me, I dazzle your socks off, plus I don't have to handle the call. And we'll have examples of that later, but sort of the earliest example of this was Amazon, who when you bought the book, they knew your next question was going to be, when's the book going to be shipped, and they send you an email before you get around to calling them, thereby precluding the call from taking place. Many companies have a goal of delighting customers. We think that universal delight probably is not a good idea, and in fact we suggest creating sensible remarkable delight, which is pick your battles. Whenever anyone talks about delight, they immediately talk about Nordstrom's taking back tires when they don't sell tires, and that's expensive, and if you do it a lot, you're going to go out of business. On the other hand, you can create a microburst of emotional connection in 20 to 40 seconds that will then raise your ratings 20 to 30 points. For instance, Chick-fil-A has now hired your grandmother to cruise the dining room, pouring sweet tea and saying, oh, would you like a few more fries? And her job description is to create microbursts of emotional connection. And then finally, you have to have a voice of the customer process that just doesn't include complaint data and survey data, but in many cases also includes operational data that says what you've done to the customer. My favorite example here is that at Federal Express, they know 10 hours before you do that the package isn't going to arrive because it missed a flight in Memphis. Then they get the frantic phone call. Then they do the satisfaction survey. The operations data is leading data that tells you exactly how many people's packages missed the flight and how many customers were inconvenienced, and in many cases is more accurate from a magnitude perspective than your complaint data. So an effective voice of the customer process includes all those types of data. Now, before we build the economic model, let's go over a little bit of what we have found from 160 recent corporations where we surveyed the head of customer experience or the head of customer service strategy. What we found was almost all companies are looking in the rearview mirror, looking at traditional survey data and complaint data. Only 25% are using operational data, and I'd mentioned FedEx, but another example is a Chicago bank where the executive office had a number of complaints on I didn't get my statements last month. And the question was, do we really have an issue? Whenever I hear somebody didn't get something, I immediately go to the mailroom and I ask the mailroom supervisor, do you ever get return mail? Oh yeah, truckloads every day. Do you get return statements? And he pulled a piece of paper out and said, yeah, last month we got 3,746 statements returned due to bad address. Who gets this report? Oh, no one's ever asked for it. So in the basement, they had an operational report that said exactly how big the issue was, while in the top of the building they were looking at 10 complaints trying to decide if they had an issue. In many cases, if you turn over rocks, you're going to find all kinds of operational data that will supplement your survey and complaint data and give you a much stronger business case with a good estimate of how many customers really in the marketplace have had the problem. We find also only about 30% of people currently are monitoring social media, and only 13% are using speech analytics. Now, why do we really care? What we found was that of these 160 companies, about a third of them, 33%, produced an end-to-end view of the customer experience, and that group of companies were more than twice as likely to have significant year-over-year improvements in customer satisfaction than those who didn't integrate the multiple types of data. You have a much more powerful business case. Another interesting finding was that we asked people how many analysts you have doing the analysis, and we found that the average was 3, but the size of the analytics staff had no correlation with the impact of the voice of the customer. So if you're doing the wrong kind of analysis, you can have a bunch of people doing it and you're not going to have any impact. The most critical finding was we asked, does the CFO buy into the business case produced by your voice of the customer? And we had a simple way of answering that, yes, somewhat, no. To the degree that people said, yes, the CFO buys in, we found 40% of those organizations had a voice of the customer process that was very effective in getting things fixed. Now, how did we define very effective? We asked people what percentage of the issues raised by the voice of the customer process actually got fixed in a timely manner? And the answer categories were 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, more than 60%. And we found that where the CFO bought in, 40% of those companies had more than 60% of the issues fixed in a timely manner. So they were able to get the vast majority of things fixed. Also, those same companies, 55% had significant year-over-year increases in customer satisfaction. Where the answer to our question on CFO buy-in was somewhat buy-in or no buy-in, only 8% of the companies were very effective in impacting customer issues, and only 23% had significant year-over-year increases in satisfaction. So CFO buy-in is critical. Also, we were surprised to find when we asked the question on VOC process effectiveness that over 20% of the respondents said, we have no idea what percentage of issues get fixed. If you're not keeping score, how can you possibly evaluate your process? So if you get nothing else out of this webinar, you should look at your voice of the customer system and say what percentage of the issues that we raise are actually getting fixed. Now, the CFO buy-in is really including 4 different dimensions. First, loyalty, but one of the critical things here is you need the value of the customer. And we would suggest that lifetime value is not necessarily the best approach, and I can come back to that if there's interest. The reason being that it's too liberal. Margin, a great experience allows you to charge premium prices. Word of mouth and word of mouse is what's most important to the chief marketing officer, because if they can get their word of mouth to be good enough, you have your customers doing your selling for you, and you don't need to spend very much on marketing. And then risk reduction is another big opportunity, because we find almost every lawsuit and insurance claim and regulatory intervention started out as a series of complaints that were not well handled. Now, in understanding the causes of customer dissatisfaction, we find that the majority of customer dissatisfaction is not caused by employees. Maybe 20% is, but 20 to 30% is caused by the customer doing stupid things. Another 40 to 60% are unpleasant surprises built into the product or service that then create unpleasant surprises for the customer. So the issue is, if you have complex directions or a complex contract that you're pretty sure nobody's reading, you are intentionally building unpleasant surprises into the product or service. Now, if you warn the customer about the top 3 issues, we find that at least 30% of all these contacts are preventable.
John, can I interrupt you? We have a question from the audience.
That'd be fine.
Regarding this concept, we have a mix of business to consumer and business to business attendees to the webinar, and a lot of this you may be focusing on B2C, but I think this comes from a B2B attendee, because they're asking, does this same concept apply to the business customer as it does to the consumer, or do you see the same trends on the B2B side as you do on the B2C side?
Actually, if anything, we find that B2B, there are more unpleasant surprises built in, and there's more customer incompetence, because there is an assumption among businesses that their customers, who are other businesses, read the forms and know how to fill them out and very effectively understand what they're doing. But unfortunately, we find that's not the case. And we've worked in $100 million aircraft sales and large financial deals, and people don't read most of that stuff. And in fact, one very interesting victory we had was an insurance company took 100 of their corporate clients. This was a group benefits company, and whenever anyone called from the group benefits department of the client company and asked a really dumb question, they would then say, could we send you a tip sheet of the top 10 ways of avoiding problems with our group benefits process? And they found that the people who were educated that way with the tip sheet ended up having 30% less problems, and they got 30% less phone calls from those companies than a control group of another 100 companies. So we find, if anything, there is more difficulty getting your commercial customers to read because they think they know your business when in fact they don't, and they make lots of mistakes.
Great.
Okay, let's move on. The next concept we have to understand is the tip of the iceberg concept, which basically says that in most marketplaces you're only hearing from 1, 2, or maybe 5% of the customers out there who have problems. And there are 4 basic reasons. First, it's too much effort to complain. Secondly, and this is the most prevalent one, there's what we call trained hopelessness, which is I've complained about this issue in the past and nothing happened, or that's the way you guys do your business. And again, this applies much more in a business-to-business environment. You guys have your policies. We've had a long-term contract with you, and we basically understand that it's aggravating, but that's the way you do it. So they don't bother complaining. There's also fear of retribution. Almost no one ever wants to complain about their service technician or their sales rep because I got to keep doing business with that person, and also I don't know where to complain. So we basically find that for each contact that you get, there's another 20 to 200 others out there, and you need to be able to take your complaint data and scale it up to the marketplace. But the requirement is you have to know what the multiplier is in terms of for each one you get, how many others are there out there. And we'll talk in a bit about exactly how you determine what that multiplier is. And Amy, I believe, has a poll that she's ready to launch.
Sure, John. Okay, I just launched the poll. Give everyone a couple of seconds to vote.
And do you want to read the question?
Oh, sure. When posing the question to senior management, do you know what your non-complaint rate is? And how would they answer? Okay, I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds. Okay, and I'm going to close out the poll. Looks like the majority have voted. And I will share the results. Overwhelmingly, 90% said no.
Okay, then you're really not playing with a full deck of cards. That's fascinating information because unless you have an idea of what your multiplier is, and again, one can certainly draw upon CCMC's research as saying it's probably somewhere between 20 to 1 and 200 to 1, but to the degree that you random sample of your customers and say, have you had problems and have you told us about them and who did you tell? Those 3 questions, you're then in a position to quantify that multiplier. And I'm happy to talk more about that. We also have a paper I'd be happy to send you that sort of walks you through the process. But unless you can scale it up to the marketplace, you're really at a great disadvantage in terms of convincing either the CEO or the CFO that this small number of complaints really implies a significant revenue impact. Now, another interesting challenge is that to the degree that you make new channels available, one organization that I was approached with, it's 2 MIT engineers, said that 20-somethings won't even call an 800 number anymore, and what they really want is a mobile app that you can just touch the little bullet hole in the center illustration down there. I just touch that and I dictate 45 seconds, I touch it again, and within 3 minutes it's delivered to the local manager and the corporation. I suggest you might want to go to 45sec.com and look at this because this we find is a way of really breaking down barriers to getting people to complain. The challenge is that you have to have multiple channels, and this, just like social media, is just another channel. Now, what to create the... Sir.
I'm going to interrupt you. We had a question on the slide, the tip of the iceberg slide, in some of the data you were presenting. The question is, what year is the data sourced from?
Okay, a lot of this, and this is sort of wild, a lot of times people are still quoting the original TARP White House study that I was the research director at TARP in the 70s and 80s, but in fact CCMC has been replicating this study every 2 years with a cross-section survey of the U.S. population. So these ratios are very current, and in fact we're going to be relaunching the RAGE study, the National RAGE study, this summer to again underline what these ratios are. So we will be updating it, but the basic answer to the question is this data has been updated at least every 2 years. The last one was in 2011, but in individual marketplaces we do this kind of a study 40 or 50 times a year, and we find the iceberg still exists and is alive and well in every marketplace.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let me move on. When you're building the unified data foundation that I alluded to that was critical to get to CIN, you need to have customer survey data, customer contact and interaction data, and that's both coded and unstructured. Speech analytics now becomes very important in this because it can give you a good picture of why things happen. What expectations did the customer bring? The internal operations data, a la my FedEx example, and employee input is very helpful too, because your frontline employees can tell you exactly why things are happening. If you pull all that together into a unified picture of the customer experience, you're now in a position to take on the role of Chief Customer Officer. And I would argue that no one else in the company really wants to do the heavy lifting of this kind of integration, so this is a huge opportunity for you. Now, to get the CFO support, you have to quantify problem impact. And this is an example where 30% of customers had a problem. And here I'm being very, very liberal, saying 25% contacted. But in fact, as I've already said, seldom do we find more than 5% contact you. A bunch may go to your channel. But if they complain and are satisfied, the good news is that 86% say they'll definitely keep repurchasing. So you actually have higher loyalty than if they had no problem whatsoever. On the other hand, if they're left dissatisfied, loyalty drops to 22%, a huge drop. But the most troubling area are the non-contactors, where 42% will repurchase. That's a 40% drop, plus they're telling almost 3 people negative things about your organization. So the ones you're not hearing from are, you have a huge drop in loyalty plus a huge pool of negative word of mouth. What one can then do is to make what we call a tree diagram. Now, the tree diagram basically says, okay, we have 200,000 customers with problems, 25% complained, 50% were satisfied, and 90% of them are going to come back. So we're only going to be losing 10%, which is 2,500 people. On the other hand, if they're dissatisfied, we're going to lose 7,000 people. But the most compelling point of this tree diagram is the 75% who do not complain. And when you look at the right-hand side, you see the preponderance of all the customers who are at risk is in that non-complaint category, the 37,500. So you have a total of 50,000 customers at risk, and at $1,000 per customer, that implies $50 million at risk. Now, this chart passes the Katie test. Katie was my 9-year-old daughter. The theory was if she couldn't understand it, no CFO could understand it. And when I said that to the CFO of Nationwide Insurance, he laughed and he said, you're right, it's an attention span issue. But this kind of a chart finance guys like, because it shows 3 parameters that are controllable. You can reduce the number of people with problems. You can get more people to tell you about the problems, and when they contact you, you can satisfy a higher percentage of them and thereby reduce that $50 million to something less. So they can look and see what's the impact of shifting any one of those parameters on the top line at risk. Now, most contact center directors say, well, I'm only in charge of one of those parameters, the percentage of people satisfied. I disagree. If you're an entrepreneurial contact center director, you should also be focusing on using your voice of the customer to act as a consultant to the rest of the organization, saying, if you will better educate the customer, if you will more clearly market, if you will more seamlessly deliver the product to the customer, we will have less customers with problems and we're all going to make a lot more money. So you basically use financial motivators and greed to get the other departments to really buy in to helping you with this. Also, if you raise the visibility of the contact center, you're going to move a bunch of the non-complainants up to complainants, and you have an opportunity to retain their loyalty. And this, again, is counterintuitive for CFOs because normally they think, gee, more calls, that's going to be more expense. But especially at $1,000 per customer, they see, gee, for every customer we get who complains to us, we have a chance of retaining a lot more money, and we're going to get a 10 or 20 times payoff by actually handling that call. So, gee, I guess more calls is better than less calls. We had one CFO who said for every incremental dollar we spend handling calls, we're going to make $7. So the idea is to get as many people to complain as possible, which is really counter to what you hear from most CFOs. Now, let's very quickly look at how changing one of these parameters will really impact the bottom line. If we get more people to contact, we go from 25% to 40% contacting, we now are finding that we have 48,000 customers at risk, and we've added $1.2 million to the bottom line. But one of the reasons why it's a relatively small contribution is that we're only satisfying 50% of the people who call. So what happens if we have higher resolution? What we find if we move satisfaction from 50% to 70%, we now have 44,000 customers at risk, and we've added $5 million to the bottom line. But it gets even better. If you have a couple of analysts on your staff who can act as internal consultants to the rest of the organization and help reduce the 200,000 customers with problems to 150,000, in other words, a 25% reduction in problems, we now have only 34,000 customers at risk, and we've added $15 million to the top line. And again, the basic strategy is that you have prevention, solicitation of complaints, and improved response. And I would argue that the call center director has jurisdiction over all three of those.
We have another question from the audience on this whole payoff of prevention discussion. The question is exactly how do you calculate the value of a customer? Is the basis the lifetime value calculation, or how are you coming up with, I know this is an example, I believe, of $1,000 per customer, but how would someone in our audience come up with that number?
Okay, Carl Sewell wrote the Lexus dealer, wrote a book called Customers for Life, and he was probably the person who really pushed the concept of lifetime value. We actually have an article entitled The Death of Lifetime Value, and the reason is that Sewell said a Cadillac customer is worth $350,000 over a 20-year lifetime purchasing pattern. The problem is most CFOs say, who knows if we're even going to be in this business 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. So what we have found is that the minute that you try saying a lifetime value of anything more than 3 years of revenue from a customer, the finance guys start really looking askance and saying, oh, you're gilding the lily. So what we suggest is you ask the finance people what they would value the customer at, and then take a number that's 2/3 of that amount. So if they say, well, I'm willing to live with 5 years of revenue, you say, okay, we'll use 3 years. Then what happens is the finance guy says, oh, well, it's more than that. And when you do your business case presentation, the only criticism finance is going to have is they're going to say, well, actually the payoff is bigger because you're being too conservative on the valuation of the customer. That's where you want to be. The minute you are criticized by finance for being too conservative, they buy into your business case, and everyone else says, well, if finance thinks it's conservative, it absolutely must be the case. So again, just send me an email, and we will be happy to send you the article on both how do you do the economic modeling, how do you integrate the data, and on the death of lifetime value.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on. How does one do the integration? Because this is something that, and how does one identify the multiplier and do the integration? As I said earlier, the way you do this is that you do a survey, very quick survey of a random sample of your customers, and it has to be a random sample, not the people who called you. And you say, have you had any problems? Did you contact anyone at our organization? Who did you contact? And you'll get this kind of a diagram where you see, in this case, 10% of people complained, and 1% went to Facebook, 5% went to consumer affairs, 4% went to the local retailer, who, by the way, throws you under the bus and says, yeah, I've had a lot of complaints on that. Here's the competing brand. And then some went to social media, and some 1 out of 500 would send a nasty email to executives. So you basically have an idea of where they go. And then, for instance, what you can then do is you then can take the data from 6 different touch points, and I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button, and come up with your best estimate. For instance, we had 20 reports on Facebook. We know that about 1% of people go to Facebook. That would imply 200 instances in the marketplace. We had 54 calls to the corporate 800 number. About 4% of people go there. Therefore, the multiplier is 25. That would imply 1,300 instances in the marketplace. Now, this is dirty data. It doesn't fit together. You have multiple estimates of the number of instances in the marketplace. You take an average. I'm an engineer. The simplest approach is normally the best. And so you basically can say, based on the fragmentary 20 Facebook, 54 800 number, and 2 emails, our best guess is that 1,330 people had problems with this product in the marketplace last period. And if it does 25% damage and the average customer is worth $200, each period that we don't deal with this issue is going to cost us another $66,000. Now, is $66,000 a big number or a small number? It depends on your situation. But it allows you to take your fragmentary contact data and translate it into a revenue implication that allows you to set priorities. Now, in addition to this, we also have a factor that really gets the chief marketing officer on board, which is word of mouth. And what you should do is ask your CMO, is word of mouth important? Everyone will say yes. Are we trying to measure it or manage it? And at that point, you'll get a blank stare, and, well, it's easier to dump another $20 million into advertising. To the degree that your contact center is servicing 10,000 people a week, you are generating a huge amount of word of mouth. The only question is it positive or negative? And if you're satisfying or delighting 80% of people, that 20% could be producing enough negative word of mouth that the net flow of word of mouth from your organization is negative. But if you take that 20% dissatisfied and convert it to 10%, all of a sudden word of mouth swings positive, and you're generating 10,000 positive referrals a week. Now, if each of those 10,000 referrals, if only 1 out of 30 of those people take action based on the referral, you are generating 300 new customers just with your day-to-day servicing of your 10,000 customers a week. So our contention is that your organization is a word-of-mouth management mechanism, and what we do in our article in Brand Week is we challenge chief marketing officers to take 10% of their mass media budget and give it to you to have more interactions with customers, and they'll probably get a bigger bang for the buck, because we find that when you ask people what percentage of your new customers come from word-of-mouth referrals, the lowest number we've ever heard is 20%, and for companies like Chick-fil-A, Harley-Davidson, and USAA, the number is well over 70%. And at Cheesecake Factory, their president recently said that their marketing expense is 20% of the average for their industry, simply because their word of mouth is so good. They don't need to do a lot of marketing. Their existing customers do their marketing for them. And I believe that we have another poll that we're ready to launch.
Yep, I'll take care of that for you, John. And this is actually the first of 2 quick polls that we're going to do with the group. First one is word of mouth important to your industry. So I'll give everybody a few seconds to vote on that and share the results, and then we'll do our second polling question. Okay, I'm going to close our first poll, and I'll share the results. And overwhelming, in line with what we anticipated, 100% are saying word of mouth is important in their industry.
Okay, this is exactly what your CMO is going to say. So you've now gotten the CMO to say word of mouth is important, and then you say, well, what are you doing about it? Next question.
Okay, we'll open up the second question. And this one is focused on what percentage of new customers are won by word of mouth. Give everyone a few seconds to vote. Okay, I'm going to close out.
Discussion going on.
Well, I'm watching people vote, and it definitely seems we're a little jumping back and forth. All right, I'm going to close this poll out, and I'll share the results. 44% are saying more than 30%. The next highest response is that they don't know at 22%.
Okay, and again, if you don't know, I suspect you're going to find your chief marketing officer doesn't know either. And it's all over the map. But the basic point is that you have a huge opportunity for impact there. And again, just contact us and we'll be happy to send you a copy of the Brand Week article, which will make your CMO very uncomfortable, which is a good thing. Okay, another benefit to the CFO is that if you look at the satisfaction with price of people who've had no recent problems with your product, you'll find in most industries that about 10% of people who've had no recent problems will say, you know, your prices seem kind of high. The minute you talk to people who've had one recent problem, sensitivity to price doubles. If they've had two problems, it doubles again. And we've seen this in every industry, business to business, B2C, where when I start having problems, my sensitivity to price goes up dramatically. So the message to finance is, if you want to charge a premium price or have high margins, you better give darn good service. And again, we would argue that the contact center is one of the best ways of educating customers on how to stay out of trouble. Plus, the contact center should act as a consultant to the rest of the organization, especially the website, on here's what you need to communicate to customers, because when somebody is befuddled, the first place they go is a website. And on your home page, you should have a top 5 questions that customers are asking. And if you have a living list of the top 5 questions on your home page, you're going to see those questions to the call center go down dramatically. And also, not only are you going to educate the people who would have called, precluding the need for the call, but you're also going to educate a huge number of people who wouldn't bother to call but had exactly the same question. And the challenge is to get marketing to give you that space. The really good companies have a living list that changes every week based on the calls received from the contact center the previous week. Now, you can also do all the economic analysis I've talked about at the problem level, and this is from a Baldrige Award winner in a B2B communications perspective, and we find that the most prevalent issue was meeting promised delivery date, and 10% of those customers wouldn't buy again, which meant that 1.3% of the total customer base was potentially at risk. Where it gets interesting is you see the second most prevalent problem, product availability within desired time frame. Translation, the customer wanted this in 2 weeks, and you looked at your inventory and said, we can't ship and get it to you in 2 weeks. They were about to spend millions of dollars raising inventories until we looked at how many wouldn't recommend, and the answer was 0. Yeah, it's a problem, but I'm not going to not buy from you. So to spend millions of dollars investing in inventory would get you no payoff in the marketplace, versus if you look at the bottom problem, returning phone calls from sales reps, that does huge damage. The point is, when you start doing an economic analysis, you're going to find that the squeaky wheel may not deserve grease, and that the problems that are most expensive to fix are not necessarily the ones that are doing the most damage. Now, I mentioned risk earlier.
John, I'm going to interrupt you because we do have several questions coming in relating to what you were speaking about. The first question, I think, relates to a couple slides ago. what was the average word of mouth that you mentioned?
Okay. Okay, the challenge here is that word of mouth is very much proportional to the customer's involvement with the product, and so every marketplace has different amounts of word of mouth. Now, again, if you're going to be measuring the multiplier, the same time you ask people, did you complain or not, you can ask people, how many of your friends or associates have you told about that issue? Also, for people who have called your organization, you can ask them, were you satisfied, and how many people have you told? And you can even go one step further, which was implied by my second slide in that series, which was, of the people you have told, how many of them, to your knowledge, have actually taken action on your referral? And a whole bunch of people are going to say, I have no idea. But what we have found is a surprisingly large number of people will say, well, I told 6 people, and I know that 2 of them actually took action. So you can get some very good data that will give you an idea of how many people are being told and how many take action. But the challenge here is that it really does vary both by marketplace and by type of issue. If it's an emotional issue, more people hear about it than if it's a pretty bland billing kind of an issue.
There's a follow-up question to that. What's a good sample size or percentage of contacts to get the random sampling asking, did you contact anyone?
Okay, you're not writing a PhD thesis, but at the same time, we find that you want to have large enough numbers that if any quality or marketing guy or market research guy looks at it, you're going to be credible. So at a minimum, you want 320 responses, and this is responses, and so that implies you're probably going to have to go to a couple thousand customers. But really, what we aim for normally is you want to get responses back from 1,000 customers. That does give you a very powerful sample, and you're going to find that of the 1,000 customers, maybe 500 of them had problems, and then only 10% of them would have contacted, so now you're down to 50 responses. So if you can say, okay, out of 500 people who had problems, only 50 or 20 or 10 contacted us, that's a big enough sample to stand up to statistical scrutiny.
I'm going to ask you one more question because it's a follow-up, and I think it's a good one. Someone from a CPG company is asking, how do I survey my customers who have not reached out to me? The discussion you're having is these are people who have reached out through whatever communication channel there is and is talking to me. The question here is, how do I talk to the people who have not contacted me, because the only information I have are for those who have called or emailed us?
Okay, there are 2 approaches. The really rigorous approach is you go to a panel, and there are many online panels now that you can rent. And companies, and this is public data, companies such as Kraft and ConAgra and Kellogg's have all done this type of a study, and in those environments, they normally will go to a panel of 20,000 customers. It is a one-time, relatively expensive study, but you then get really rigorous data. Another convenience sample, which is open to a little more criticism, but I think would be acceptable, is if you have an online community of users of your product. Not all those people have had problems, and there's a good chance that most of them have not called to complain. They're participating for promotions or something else, and that's what we call a convenience sample that would give you a pretty good snapshot, because they're fairly heavy users of your product. But yes, you do not want to do this analysis of only of people who have contacted you. You need to get an idea of how many have not contacted you, so you need to go to a random sample. So the panel or your communities are the best approaches.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Okay, let's quickly whiz through the end of this. As I had mentioned earlier, we find that if you simply show your lawyers and your regulatory people this chart saying that, gee, the settlements and the insurance claims on the right-hand side all started out as problems on the left-hand side, and by the way, we could have warned a lot of those people on how to avoid those problems. All of a sudden, they get it, and they understand that aggressive complaint solicitation and customer education are some of the best ways of enhancing the issues. And again, a highly visible complaint process reduces complaints to channels, which then helps you get shelf space, because retailers don't want to handle products that cause problems. And also we find that when people complain to the retailer, they are 20% less loyal when they complain to channels. And then the last piece of data is, I talked about delight earlier. We find the heroics, the Nordstrom's taking back tires when they don't sell tires, gives you a 12 to 14 point lift. But if I have a 90-second schmooze on the phone with a customer, and my favorite example is one customer said, oh, I was talking to one of your reps on the phone and they heard Fluffy the dog barking in the background, so we digressed and talked about Fluffy for 90 seconds, and I connected, and you're a wonderful company. You got a 25-point top box lift. If I cross-sell you something you can really use, I get a 30-point, and if I proactively educate you on how to avoid problems, I even get a higher lift in loyalty. To enhance the reporting and really move into a consulting mode, don't do data dumps on your executives, but simplify to the 3 issues that have the biggest economic impact. Tailor the report to each function, which is more work for you, but the report will actually get read. At Colgate, Chip Horner says he holds a separate meeting with each function to make sure that they actually understand the report. He has tremendous impact across the organization and is viewed as the chief internal consultant. Recruit analysts from each function to help with the analysis. And don't just say you got a problem. Say you got a problem, here's how much it's costing you for each month you don't take action, and here's my suggested action plan. Suggest process metrics and humanize the data with quotes. To say we had 85 of these is interesting, but here's a recording of the angst of one consumer has dramatic impact. You can also play that same recording for your production plant people, and it has a huge impact. You don't criticize performance or embarrass your internal client. You appeal to greed, saying, you're doing a great job, but look how much more money you could make if we just dealt with this issue. Now, in terms of metrics for measuring the customer experience, the traditional approach has been customer satisfaction. The only problem is consumers mitigate their satisfaction with their expectations. I guess I'm satisfied given I didn't really expect much. Net Promoter Score is the big thing that's now being used. The problem there is that it says that people who give you a 7 or an 8 are passive. They are not passive. They're spreading mediocre word of mouth. Yeah, I sort of was satisfied. Customer effort is another metric that's used a lot, and the problem with customer effort is, if you're evaluating your contact center, is the first place the customer most likely went was the website, and if they had trouble on the website finding what they wanted, only then did they call you, but they're going to blame you for the bad website. So if you're not in charge of the website, customer effort is really lowering your scores unnecessarily. We think problem experience, asking your customers, have you had any recent problems, is one of the best approaches, because problems can be counted, they're tangible, and they can be fixed, and also on average they create a 20% drop in loyalty. Delight, like I've just described, is a great way of understanding what can you do to cause delight, and asking people, would you recommend, or have you recommended? Gallo was just saying that they have done it that way. Is a very good approach. Now, to summarize, the departments with a financial interest in an improved customer experience are marketing and brand, finance, quality, channel management, risk, legal, regulatory, and PR, HR, and product development. I would argue you can demonstrate the economic benefit of an improved customer experience to all these departments and show that you're the best organization to achieve that benefit. So hopefully I've also dispelled a series of myths. And again, we have a paper that describes these myths. First, always exceed customer expectations. No, only when it makes sense. Secondly, answering the phone fast is the key to success. No, it's what happens after the phone is answered. people prefer talking to people? No. People are not calling you for their social experience of the day. Most people would like to self-serve. So again, you need to be a consultant to the website to get them to have the living list on the home page and to have a good sitemap. The customer is always right. No, the customer does dumb things, but you still get blamed for it. Complaints are down. Things are getting better. Trained hopelessness may have set in. You need to aggressively solicit complaints. Employees are the cause of most dissatisfaction. Hopefully I've dispelled that completely. Price and cost cutting is the key to success. What I've shown is if people don't have problems, they're willing to pay a significant premium for the product. We're better than average in our industry. That's great. You could be the best of a poor lot. We're at 90% satisfaction. Let's declare victory. The leading companies like Harley and USAA and Chick-fil-A are well above 90, but to their credit, their CEOs always say, yes, in that last few percentage points, there's tens of millions of dollars. Are there no-brainers? And there always are no-brainers. And we've measured net promoter and customer effort. We're done. I think I pointed out the weaknesses in both of those. So you need to evaluate yourself, and you'll be getting, are you proactively educating to prevent problems? And even in CPG, you can highlight in the directions how to avoid problems. Are you aggressively soliciting complaints? Are you quantifying the problem impact looking at revenue and word of mouth? And are you setting your priorities based on revenue, not just on cost? So in summary, you want to identify the financial hot buttons of each function and understand the multiplier and root causes. You want to quantify the revenue implications so you can appeal to greed. Be sure to incorporate the CFO and CMO assumptions. Take control of the voice of the customer and then become the chief customer officer and quantify the payoff of proactive education, connection, and delivering psychic pizza. Everything we've talked about is outlined in Strategic Customer Service, which is on Amazon for less than 20 bucks, or for a package of my articles, send me an email, and you can also follow me on Twitter at jgoodman888. Thanks very much, and let me turn it back to Dan.
Thank you, John. Terrific presentation. Just listening to this, I can understand how it's very common to get overwhelmed with statistics and numbers and the traditional school of thinking, but once you really step back and analyze this and you package and present the numbers correctly and they're interpreted correctly, it could have a tremendous impact on the customer experience and the customer service infrastructure. So we are coming to the end of our hour, but I do want to get to maybe one or two questions. The one question we had is about the multiplier. We had a couple about that. In general, the questions are, the multipliers are, is there any commonality of multipliers across industries, across companies, across product segments, that there's some consistency in that multiplier, or are they all unique by company, by product, and have to be calculated uniquely?
Well, the convenient answer would be to say if you used a 25-to-1 multiplier, you're probably somewhere in the ballpark, and some very well-known companies sort of take that blunt instrument approach. The problem with that is that if you're sort of doing it a disservice, because in some cases the multiplier might only be 10-to-1. In other cases it could be as high as we've seen of 2,000-to-1. So to get started, you could use a 25-to-1, but I would strongly encourage you for at least one product to do the actual analysis, and your market research people can help you, and that will then really make believers of everyone. Also, the other way of getting the CFO to buy into this is to ask the CFO about his or her behavior the last time they had a bad experience at a restaurant or their car dealer. And when they then say, oh yeah, I didn't complain, but boy, I didn't go back, you say, guess what? Our customers behave the same way, and the light bulb goes on.
We're going to do one more question. On one slide, a little ways back, you mentioned that the more problems someone experiences with the company, the more sensitivity they have to price. The question regards that regarding that is, isn't that an argument for first call resolution and doing anything you can to solve someone's problem the first time and prevent other problems from happening?
Oh, absolutely. We basically find that you get 2 bites at the apple. The first time you're going to have very high levels of satisfaction. If I solve it on the second one, there's going to be some attenuation, but I still have you. If a customer has to come back a third time, you basically could give them the company and they're not going to be happy. So yes, first contact resolution is critical, but in Psychic Pizza, ideally what you do is you warn the customer in advance so he never gets into the trouble whatsoever. And my FedEx example is they would actually go to people and say, we have bad news, it missed the flight, but if you have it in soft copy, go to the nearest FedEx Kinko's, we'll rebuild it for you right there, so it will arrive on time. And you take a disaster and turn it into a, wow, you guys are really good.
Great. Well, we are at the end of our hour, John. I would like to thank the audience for their participation and thank John for a very thorough and insightful presentation. All of our guests today will be receiving a copy of the presentation, and that will be followed tomorrow with a brief survey asking for your feedback. If any of you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact